They ordered her to serve coffee. It was a simple, dismissive command, a casual assertion of rank over a woman they saw as little more than a piece of administrative furniture. Colonel Grant Mercer didn't even look at her when he said it. His eyes fixed on a tactical map that was already 24 hours out of date. He saw her designation, specialist, administrative support, and made an assumption. It was a perfectly logical assumption, and it was catastrophically wrong. The turning point wouldn't come with a shout or a protest, but with the chilling silence of a 4-star general who would later walk into the chaos of the command center, see the quiet woman at its heart, and freeze as if he'd seen a ghost. Because in a way, he had. One arrival. The air at forward operating base Dagger Point was thin and sharp, tasting of dust and generator exhaust. It scraped the lungs with every breath, a constant reminder of the unforgiving altitude and the hostile territory that stretched for 100 miles in every direction. Specialist Claire Harlow stepped down from the rear of the transport truck, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The movement was economical, fluid, betraying none of the stiffness most personnel felt after the rattling 8-hour journey up the mountain pass. Her boots made a soft crunch on the gravel, a sound immediately swallowed by the oppressive wind. The base was an ugly functional scar on the landscape. Pesco barriers formed a perimeter, their beige fabric stained with rust-colored dirt. A communications tower, skeletal and stark, clawed at the perpetually overcast sky. Soldiers moved with a weary purpose, their faces etched with a mixture of boredom and tension. No one paid her any mind. A new admin clerk was less than a curiosity. She was a logistical footnote. Another mouth to feed. Another body to assign to a cramped bunk. A tired-looking corporal with a clipboard ticked her name off a manifest. Harlow, right. Barack C, Bunk 7. Quartermaster will issue your linens. Report to the TOC for assignment at 0800. He pointed vaguely toward a row of drab, prefabricated huts. He didn't offer to show her the way. Claire simply nodded. Her gaze swept the compound, not as a newcomer looking for landmarks, but as an assessor cataloging a system. She noted the blind spot near the Western Guard Tower, where the shadow of a supply depot created a perfect pocket of darkness. She saw the slight sag in the concertina wire near the southern fence, just enough for a determined infiltrator to exploit. Her eyes followed the power cables running from the main generators to the tactical operations center. Noting the exposed junction box, vulnerable to weather and sabotage, she registered the patrol rotations, the lazy way a sentry held his rifle, the subtle shift in weight that spoke of fatigue. It was a process so ingrained it was subconscious, like breathing. Inside Barack C, the air was thick with the smell of stale sweat and gun oil. Bunk 7 was a top rack, its mattress thin and lumpy. She dropped her duffel, the contents shifting with a muted metallic clink that was heavier than clothing ought to be. As she made the bed, her movements were precise, the hospital corners of her blanket sharp enough to cut. A young private in the bunk below watched her, intrigued by her silence. "First time this high up?" he asked, trying to be friendly. "No," Claire replied, her voice low and even. She didn't elaborate. She spent the remainder of the afternoon observing. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She watched the flow of people, the rhythm of the base. She saw the mechanic struggling with a faulty fuel pump on a light armored vehicle, their frustration a palpable thing. She saw the medics running drills, their movements efficient, but lacking the desperate urgency of true combat experience. She saw everything, and in the quiet calculus of her mind, she began to map the base's weaknesses, not out of judgment, but out of a deeply buried, instinctual sense of responsibility. She was a ghost in their machine, invisible, silent, and already more aware of its flaws than the men who ran it. 2. Dismissal. At 0800 sharp, Claire stood before the commander's desk in the Tactical Operations Center, the nerve center of FOB Dagger Point. The TOC was a cramped, windowless container humming with the electronic drone of servers and radios. Maps covered one wall, littered with pins and grease pencil markings. Men with headsets murmured into microphones, their voices a low, constant thrum. Colonel Grant Mercer didn't look up from the report he was reading. He was a man in his late 40s with a face that seemed permanently fixed in a scowl of mild irritation. His uniform was crisp, his presence imposing. He radiated an aura of absolute authority, an authority built on regulation and the rigid hierarchy of the military. "Specialist Harlow," he said, his voice flat. He finally lifted his eyes, giving her a cursory once-over. He saw a woman of average height with dark hair pulled back in a severe regulation bun. Her face was impassive, her posture perfectly still. There was nothing remarkable about her, nothing to suggest anything beyond her file. And her file was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation. Transfer from the 7th Logistics Battalion, a rear echelon unit known for shuffling paperwork. Before that, a string of similar assignments, all non-combat, all administrative. The last 5 years of her service record were heavily redacted, black bars covering entire pages. A common occurrence for personnel with mundane security clearance reviews or minor disciplinary actions that were later expunged. To Mercer, it spelled mediocrity. "Your file is sparse, Specialist," he said, tapping a finger on the folder. "Says here, you're proficient in records management and supply requisition. We don't have much need for that. This is a frontline position. We deal in bullets and intel, not paper clips." Claire remained silent. Her orders were to report for duty. She had Mercer's side. The sound of a busy man burdened with another triviality. "Look, I didn't ask for you, and frankly, I don't have a slot for you. The TOC is already overstaffed with comms techs and intel analysts who actually know what they're doing." He leaned back in his chair, a smirk touching his lips. He gestured toward the corner of the room where a coffee percolator sat on a small table. "However, morale is a crucial component of operational readiness." Several of the junior officers in the room exchanged knowing glances. The slight was obvious, public. "Since you're not busy, Specialist, make yourself useful," Mercer continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "The pot is empty. Coffee black, and keep it hot. That's your primary assignment until I figure out where to stick you." He turned back to his report, the dismissal absolute. He had categorized her, filed her away as irrelevant. To him, she was now the coffee girl. Claire's expression didn't flicker. There was no flash of anger in her eyes, no tightening of her jaw. An insult could only land if the recipient valued the source. She simply turned, her movements as economical as ever, and walked toward the percolator. She picked up the carafe, her grip steady. As she filled it with water, her mind was already moving past the petty humiliation. She was cataloging the layout of the TOC, the positions of the terminals, the model numbers of the encryption hardware, the frayed power cord on the primary satellite uplink. The coffee was irrelevant. The information was not. 3. Observation. For the next 72 hours, Claire performed her assigned duty with unnerving perfection. The coffee was never cold. The pot was never empty. She moved through the TOC like a phantom, refilling mugs, cleaning the station, and remaining utterly silent. She became part of the background, a fixture as unremarkable as the humming server racks. And from that position of invisibility, she learned. Her observation was a constant, silent process. While pouring coffee for a bleary-eyed intel analyst, she'd glance at his screen, not at the classified text, but at the diagnostic data in the corner. She saw the latency spikes in the network, the intermittent packet loss from drone feed Alpha, the one that monitored the treacherous northern ridge. The analyst, focused on his target, never noticed her fleeting glance or the way her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. While clearing mugs from the comm station, she listened. She didn't hear the words, but the cadence, the rhythm of the radio traffic. She learned to distinguish the calm, routine check-ins of the perimeter guards from the slightly more hurried reports of the long-range patrols. She heard the subtle static that preceded a signal drop from the deep valley relays and noted that it occurred most frequently between 0300 and 0400 when the atmospheric temperature was at its lowest. She filed the information away. She watched the people. She saw Lieutenant Ryan Calder, the ambitious second in command, consistently over-reporting minor enemy movements, trying to build a case for more aggressive action. She saw Sergeant Lucas Navarro, the senior NCO, his hands showing the slightest tremor as he briefed the outgoing patrols, a sign of burnout he had behind a gruff exterior. She saw the way the younger soldiers looked to Navarro for reassurance and the way Calder looked at Mercer for approval. She mapped the entire social and command structure, its strengths and its many fractures, all from the periphery. Her movements took her all over the base. On her way to the mess hall, she'd take a slightly longer route passing the motor pool. She noted the same light armored vehicle still sitting idle, its engine cowling open. The mechanics were treating a symptom, the fuel pump, when her brief glance at the grime patterns on the engine block suggested the real problem was a clogged injector line, a detail they had missed. She walked past the armory, her ears picking up the distinct, slightly off-key sound of a rifle being improperly reassembled by a nervous private. Each night in her bunk, she didn't sleep immediately. She lay in the darkness, the sounds and sights of the day replaying in her mind. She constructed a complete schematic of the base. Not just its physical layout, but its operational and systemic vulnerabilities. The faulty drone feed, the predictable comms dead zone, the overambitious lieutenant, the burned-out NCO, the vulnerable junction box, the improperly maintained vehicle. Each was a single point of failure. Together, they formed a cascade, a disaster waiting for a catalyst. She wasn't worried. She wasn't afraid. She was simply aware. Her mind a cold, clear instrument of analysis. She felt a familiar, deeply buried stirring. The instinct of a troubleshooter, a problem solver. It was an instinct she had been ordered to suppress for years. But here, in this place of quiet, creeping dysfunction, it was beginning to wake up. Pressure. The catalyst arrived on the fourth day, just before dawn. It began not with an explosion but with a whisper of static. Falcon 2, this is Dagger TOC. Radio check. Over. Silence. The comms tech, a young specialist named Ethan Briggs, frowned and tapped his headset. Falcon 2, do you copy? Over. The silence that answered was heavier this time, more profound. Falcon 2 was a 4-man reconnaissance patrol assigned to the northern ridge, the same area monitored by the intermittently failing drone feed Alpha. They were due for their hourly check-in. They were 3 minutes late. Colonel Grant Mercer, who had been reviewing overnight reports, looked up. What is it, Briggs? No contact with Falcon 2, sir. Probably just atmospheric interference. The signal gets weak in the canyons up there. Claire, standing by her coffee station, didn't move, but she knew it wasn't atmospherics. It was 0430, right in the middle of the dead zone window she had identified. Lieutenant Ryan Calder stepped forward, eager. Sir, maybe they've made contact. We should get the QRF spinning up. Negative, Lieutenant, Mercer snapped, his voice tight. We don't launch a quick reaction force for a missed radio check. Keep trying to raise them, Briggs, and get me eyes on them. Switch drone feed Alpha to their last known position. Trying, sir, the drone operator said, his fingers flying across a keyboard, but Alpha feed is down. Solid red light. Hardware malfunction. Looks like. A low murmur of anxiety filled the TOC. 2 points of failure back to back, the missing patrol and the dead drone feed. Coincidence was possible, but in this part of the world, it was a dangerous assumption. The pressure began to build. Ethan Briggs frantically cycled through frequencies. His calls met with nothing but dead air. The drone operator rebooted his system twice to no effect. Mercer's face was a granite mask, but a vein pulsed in his temple. He was flying blind. Get me Viper 1 on the horn, Mercer ordered, referring to another patrol in an adjacent sector. I want to know if they've heard anything, seen anything. Viper 1 is reporting heavy signal degradation, sir, Briggs replied, his voice strained. They can barely hear us. It's like the whole northern comms network is collapsing now. The low murmur in the TOC gave way to a palpable tension. The men who had been murmuring into their headsets were now sitting bolt upright, their eyes wide. This wasn't a glitch anymore. This was a systemic failure. It felt coordinated. What about the satellite uplink? Mercer barked. Unstable, sir. We're getting massive packet loss. I can't maintain a secure connection. Panic began to curdle the air. The calm, controlled environment of the TOC was dissolving into frantic, disjointed reactions. Calder was shouting suggestions for search grids. Mercer was barking contradictory orders, and the technicians were reporting a cascade of system failures. The entire electronic nervous system of the base was going dark, and a patrol was lost in the wilderness. Through it all, Claire Harlow stood by the coffee pot, an island of absolute stillness in a sea of rising chaos. She watched the screens flicker and die. She saw the fear on the young soldiers' faces and the dawning horror on Mercer's. They were flailing, reacting to each failure as a separate crisis, unable to see the pattern. But Claire saw it. She had seen it for days. And she knew what was happening. It wasn't just a failure. It was an attack, a sophisticated electronic warfare attack designed to deafen and blind them before the real strike came, and time was running out. Claire set the coffee carafe down on the warmer. The click of glass on metal was barely audible, but in the growing chaos, it seemed to cut through the noise. She took 3 precise steps away from her station, her movement so deliberate it drew the eye of a terrified-looking Ethan Briggs. He watched her as she walked not toward the exit, but toward the auxiliary comms console. It was an ancient piece of hardware, a relic from a decade ago, kept for spare parts and forgotten by everyone. It was covered in a thin layer of dust. No one had powered it on in years. Specialist, what in God's name do you think you're doing? Mercer snarled, his attention finally torn from the failing main screens. Get back to your post. Claire didn't respond. She didn't have time to explain. Her fingers swept across the console's power strip, flipping a series of switches in a sequence that wasn't random. A low hum emanated from the machine as vacuum tube amplifiers warmed up. The screen, a monochrome green display, flickered to life, showing a command line prompt. Her hands descended on the keyboard. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. Her fingers moved with a blur of speed and precision that was utterly mesmerizing. It wasn't the clumsy pecking of a clerk. It was the fluid, confident dance of a master craftsman. The room began to quiet down, the frantic shouting replaced by a stunned silence as every eye in the TOC fixed on her. She wasn't using a graphical interface. She was typing raw code, her commands scrolling up the green screen in a torrent of complex syntax. She bypassed the standard network protocols that were under assault, forcing a hardwired connection to the base's primary transceiver. Config set FOB in 24 to 28. Zagel_hopsec equals 7159. What is she doing? Calder whispered, his jaw slack. That's a manual frequency hopping sequence, Ethan Briggs breathed, his voice filled with disbelief. That's not in any manual. You'd have to build the algorithm from scratch. Claire ignored them. She was in her element, the chaos of the room fading into a single point of focus. She was no longer a specialist serving coffee. She was a signals intelligence operator of the highest caliber, a ghost in the machine, making the machine her own. She forced the satellite uplink into a narrow beam burst mode, a brute force method to punch through the electronic jamming. A sudden, loud squawk of static erupted from the auxiliary console speaker, making everyone jump. It was followed by another, then another. Claire's fingers never stopped moving, refining the signal, filtering the noise. Give me a headset, she said, her first words since the crisis began. Her voice was calm, level, and held an authority that no one dared question. Ethan Briggs scrambled to unplug his own headset and handed it to her. She put it on, one hand still flying across the keyboard while the other adjusted the receiver. The static resolved into a faint distorted voice. Repeat under fire. Coordinates broken. Falcon 2. This is Dagger TOC, Claire said into the microphone, her voice a blade of pure composure. I have you on a back channel. Your signal is weak. Send location data in a single burst. On my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark. A high-pitched squeal filled the headset. A data burst on her screen. A string of encrypted numbers appeared. Claire's fingers moved again, her other hand flying to a different part of the keyboard. As she ran a decryption key that seemed to come from her own memory, a set of coordinates appeared on the green screen. She pulled off the headset and turned, facing the dumbstruck command staff. Falcon 2 is pinned down at coordinates 345,612 north 681433 east, she stated, her voice devoid of triumph. They are taking effective fire from an elevated position. Their communications and navigation equipment are disabled. They are wounded. The TOC was utterly silent. Colonel Grant Mercer stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He looked from the dead state-of-the-art primary consoles to the ancient humming machine she had resurrected. He looked at the coordinates she had written on a notepad. Then he looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He didn't see a clerk. He saw an impossibility. Silence stretched for 3 long seconds. A vacuum where the old hierarchy had collapsed and a new reality had not yet formed. The men in the room looked from Claire to Colonel Mercer, waiting to see how the commander would react to this complete and utter subversion of his authority. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Mercer closed his mouth, a muscle working in his jaw. The anger and panic had vanished from his face, replaced by a profound, shell-shocked confusion. He was a man whose entire world, governed by rank and regulation, had just been turned upside down by the coffee girl. He walked slowly over to the auxiliary console, his eyes scanning the lines of code still visible on the green screen. It was a language he didn't understand, but he understood the result. She had pulled a signal out of thin air when his entire multi-million-dollar comms array had failed. He turned to Ethan Briggs. Briggs, confirm those coordinates. Ethan galvanized into action, hurried to a paper map, the only system still reliable. He plotted the point with a ruler and grease pencil. Coordinates confirmed, sir. It's a box canyon on the north face of the ridge. A classic kill zone. The implications sank in. Falcon 2 hadn't just lost their radio. They had been herded into a trap. Mercer looked back at Claire. The condescension was gone, vaporized. In its place was a wary, grudging curiosity. How did you do that? Your primary systems are compromised by a coordinated electronic attack, Claire replied, her tone factual, not accusatory. The enemy is using wide-spectrum jamming to isolate the base and targeted spoofing to disable specific hardware like the drone feed. The auxiliary console is analog-based. It's too old to be susceptible to those methods. I established a frequency-hopping signal on a non-standard band to bypass the jamming. She explained it with the simple clarity of a mechanic describing a faulty engine. There was no pride in her voice. No, I told you so. It was just a statement of fact. The shift in the room was palpable. The junior officers and NCOs were no longer looking at her with disdain or pity. They were looking at her with a mixture of awe and fear. They had watched her operate with a level of competence that bordered on supernatural. She hadn't just fixed a problem. She had demonstrated a mastery of their own field that dwarfed their collective expertise. The young private from her barracks, who was running messages to the TOC, stared at her as if she were a completely different person. Lieutenant Ryan Calder, who had been so eager to take charge, was now silent, his face pale. He had been proposing blind search grids while she was surgically extracting actionable intelligence from a wall of static. He understood perhaps better than anyone the chasm between his ambition and her ability. Colonel Grant Mercer stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing. He picked up her personnel file from his desk, the one he had dismissed so easily. The black redacted bars seemed to mock him now. They weren't hiding mediocrity. They were hiding this. Who are you? Mercer asked the question, almost a whisper. Claire Harlow met his gaze. Specialist Claire Harlow. Administrative support. It was the correct answer. And yet, it was no answer at all. It was a shield, a wall of regulation she hid behind. But the illusion was shattered. No one in that room would ever see her as just a clerk again. She was an enigma, a weapon of unknown origin who had just saved 4 men's lives from a desk in the corner of the room. And the second larger test was only moments away. 7. The second test. The immediate crisis had shifted from communication to survival. Falcon 2 was trapped, wounded, and their attackers were closing in. Get the QRF ready to move. Mercer barked, his command voice returning, though it now lacked its earlier arrogance. He turned to the map. We'll approach from the south. Use the access road to get as close as we can, then dismount and assault the high ground. Sir, that's a 3-hour approach, Calder interjected, finding his voice. They'll be overrun by then. The enemy knows we're coming. They'll have the road mined and covered. It's the only viable route, Mercer countered, his frustration mounting. He was a conventional tactician and the enemy had just taken all his conventional tools off the board. He was trying to solve a new problem with old solutions. He stopped, his gaze falling once more on Claire. She was standing by the map, her eyes tracing the topographical lines, her expression unreadable. The entire TOC staff was watching him, waiting. The decision he made next would define his leadership. He swallowed his pride. It was a bitter pill, but the lives of his men were on the line. Specialist, he said. The word no longer an insult, but a plea. You seem to see things the rest of us don't. You have the board. What do you see? It was the ultimate concession of authority. He was handing the tactical planning for a live combat operation to a specialist whose official job was making coffee. It was an act of desperation and a tacit admission of her superior ability. Claire didn't react to the monumental nature of the request. She simply stepped closer to the map. Her finger traced a path that no one else had even considered. The direct approach is a feint, she began, her voice low and steady, drawing the command staff in. The enemy expects it. They're using the box canyon as bait to draw our QRF into a larger ambush on the southern road. That's why they initiated the comms blackout, to force us into a predictable aggressive response. She pointed to a different part of the map miles away from the canyon. Here there's a geological survey marker for an old mining ventilation shaft. This is marked as collapsed on this map, which is 10 years out of date. But satellite thermal imaging from 3 years ago, if you cross-reference it with geological strata reports, shows a consistent temperature differential. It's not fully collapsed. It's likely open. She looked up, her eyes sweeping over the faces of the stunned officers. The shaft's exit is here, she said, her finger landing on a point just 300 meters above and behind the enemy's overwatch position. It bypasses their kill zone completely. You send a small team, 4 men maximum, lightly equipped, through the shaft. They will achieve complete surprise. Neutralize the overwatch and Falcon 2 can exfiltrate through the canyon floor while the enemy is disoriented. What about the main QRF? Calder asked, unnerved by the audacity of the plan. You send them, Claire said, pointing back to the southern road. Loud. Obvious. Let the enemy see them taking the bait. They'll be the distraction. The real rescue will be over before the QRF even makes contact. The plan was brilliant. It was unorthodox, incredibly risky, and relied on a stunningly deep synthesis of desperate information. Geology, old maps, thermal imaging reports she could only have theorized existed. It was a plan born not of military doctrine, but of an intelligence operative's mindset. Misdirection, stealth, and exploiting an enemy's assumptions. Mercer stared at the map, seeing the logic of it instantly. It was a checkmate in 3 moves. He felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just tactical competence. This was artistry. He looked at Navarro, the burned-out but deeply respected NCO. Navarro, you heard the lady. Pick your 3 best men. You're going down a hole. Navarro, who had been listening with rapt attention, nodded, a flicker of his old fire returning to his eyes. He looked at Claire, not with the awe of the junior officers, but with the profound respect of a fellow professional recognizing a master of the craft. "Yes, sir," Navarro said, but his gaze remained on Claire. "We'll need a comms link that works in that shaft, something that won't get jammed." Claire was already turning back to the auxiliary console. "I'll configure 2 handhelds for a low-frequency subterranean repeater system. You'll have line-of-sight communication within the shaft and a single-burst transmission capability once you're at the exit. Keep it brief." Mercer watched her, no longer confused, but deeply humbled. He had ordered this woman to serve coffee. Now he had just handed her the lives of 2 of his squads, and he had done so with more confidence than he had ever felt in his own plans. The second test was underway. 8. The reveal. As Navarro and his hand-picked team scrambled to gather their gear, a new and unexpected variable arrived at FOB Dagger Point. The thumping beat of a Black Hawk helicopter cut through the air, a sound far heavier and more powerful than the light utility choppers that usually serviced the base. It landed in a whirlwind of dust and gravel, its fuselage bearing the 4-star insignia of a full general. The ramp lowered and out strode General Adrian Falkner, commander of all regional forces. He was on a surprise inspection tour, a fact that would have sent Colonel Grant Mercer into a panic on any other day. Today, it was a distant secondary concern. Falkner strode into the TOC, his aide trailing behind him. He was a man who commanded respect with his presence alone. Tall, grim-faced, with eyes that missed nothing. He took in the scene at a glance, the dead primary consoles, the frantic energy of a rescue mission in progress, and the small group of officers huddled around an ancient piece of equipment. "Colonel Mercer," Falkner's voice boomed, cutting through the tension. "Report. What in the hell is going on here? My command ship lost all contact with this entire sector 20 minutes ago." Mercer snapped to attention, his face pale. "General Falkner, sir, apologies for the situation. We are under a sophisticated EW attack. We lost contact with a patrol, Falcon 2. We have a rescue operation in motion." Falkner's sharp eyes scanned the room, cataloging every detail. He saw the coordinates on the map, the unorthodox plan taking shape. His gaze swept past the officers, past the technicians, and then it stopped. It stopped on the woman with her back to him, her hands still flying over the keyboard of the auxiliary console, fine-tuning the low-frequency radios for Navarro and his team. For a moment, he just stared at her profile, at the severe bun of dark hair, the ramrod-straight posture, the intense focus. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face, then confusion, then a dawning, stomach-dropping recognition. He took a half-step forward, his inspection forgotten, his aide ignored. The blood drained from his face, leaving the weathered skin ashen. The formidable commanding general suddenly looked like a man who had seen a specter from a half-forgotten nightmare. "Sir," his aide asked, noticing the general's strange behavior. "General, are you all right?" Falkner didn't hear him. He was frozen, his mind reeling back years to a classified briefing in a soundproof room. To a mission so dark it was officially denied, to a name that was spoken only in whispers among the highest echelons of special operations. A ghost, an asset who could dismantle enemy command structures from the inside out, who could disappear behind enemy lines for months, who was a master of infiltration, sabotage, and signals intelligence. An operative who was officially listed as killed in action 5 years ago. He whispered a single word, a name that was not a name but a designation. It was barely audible. Yet in the suddenly silent TOC, it landed like a thunderclap. Kestrel, the name hung in the air, meaningless to most in the room. But Grant Mercer, who had spent the last hour staring at Claire Harlow's redacted file, felt a jolt, as if from a live wire. Kestrel. It wasn't a name. It was a legend. A boogeyman that enemy commanders told stories about. The architect of the infamous Operation Silent Collapse, which had decapitated an entire enemy network without a single shot fired. An operative so valuable, so secret that her existence was classified above the level of most generals. Claire finished her work on the radios and turned, her face as impassive as ever. She saw Adrian Falkner, and for the first time a flicker of something registered in her eyes. Not surprise, but a weary resignation. The ghost had been seen. Falkner took another involuntary step back. The fear on his face was real stark. It wasn't the fear of a subordinate for a superior, but the primal fear a man feels when confronted with something he knows is impossibly lethally dangerous. He had once authorized a mission for Kestrel, had seen the results, and it had haunted him ever since. He was looking at a living weapon, and he knew better than anyone what she was capable of. 9. Respect. The rescue mission unfolded with the chilling precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Lucas Navarro's team navigated the darkness of the ventilation shaft, their comms working flawlessly. They emerged exactly where Claire had predicted, directly behind the enemy sniper and his spotter. The engagement was swift and silent. With the Overwatch eliminated, Navarro gave the signal. Falcon 2, battered but alive, scrambled from the canyon floor using the pre-planned exfiltration route. Simultaneously, the main QRF, still miles away on the southern road, engaged in a loud, dramatic, and utterly pointless firefight with a token enemy force left behind as bait. By the time the insurgents realized their trap had been dismantled from within, it was too late. All 8 soldiers were accounted for and heading back to base. When Lucas Navarro and his team returned to the TOC, they were grimy, exhausted, but radiating a triumphant energy. They bypassed Grant Mercer. They bypassed the stunned-looking Adrian Falkner. Navarro walked directly to Claire, who was quietly wiping down the coffee station as if nothing had happened. He stopped in front of her, his team flanking him. He was a combat veteran, a man who had seen it all, and his eyes were filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. He drew himself up to his full height, his movements sharp despite his fatigue, and rendered a perfect parade ground salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." The other 3 members of his team followed suit, their salutes crisp and unwavering. They weren't saluting a specialist. They were saluting their savior. The rescued members of Falcon 2 brought into the TOC for debriefing, saw the exchange. The patrol leader, a young sergeant with a makeshift bandage on his arm, walked over and added his own salute to the display. "We owe you our lives, ma'am." In the rigid world of military protocol, it was a breathtaking moment. Enlisted men, NCOs saluting a specialist, calling her ma'am. It was the ultimate unscripted show of earned respect, a recognition that transcended rank. Grant Mercer watched it all. His face a complex mask of humility and awe. He walked over to Claire, stopping a respectful distance away. He didn't offer an apology. Words would have been inadequate. Instead, he offered the only thing he had left. His professional respect. He extended his hand. "Specialist Harlow," he said, his voice steady and clear. "Your transfer to administrative support has been reevaluated. Effective immediately, you are assigned to this command team as a senior tactical advisor. Welcome to Dagger Point." Claire looked at his outstretched hand and after a moment shook it. Her grip was firm, her eyes meeting his without animosity. It was an acceptance. Later, after the commotion had died down, Adrian Falkner approached her. He found her alone, staring at the now fully functional tactical map. The fear was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, profound solemnity. "They listed you as Kia after the Argent's incident," he said softly. "We held a memorial, a closed service. No name on the tombstone." "A desk job was part of the arrangement," Claire replied, her voice quiet. "A way to disappear. They buried Kestrel. I was supposed to stay buried." "Some ghosts don't stay in the ground," Falkner said. He paused, his expression heavy with the weight of all the things he couldn't say. "It's good to see you're still watching over them, Kestrel. It's good to know you're still on the wall." He didn't salute. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of respect between equals, between 2 people who understood the true cost of the shadows they inhabited. It was a quieter, but perhaps more meaningful acknowledgement than any salute. The next morning, the sun rose over the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across FOB Dagger Point. The air was still cold, but the oppressive tension of the past few days had lifted, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. The base felt different, felt safer. Claire Harlow was not in the TOC. She stood near the western perimeter by the same blind spot she had noted upon her arrival. She was watching the sunrise, a simple ceramic mug held in her hands. The coffee inside was hot, and she had made it for herself. She was no longer invisible. As soldiers moved about the base, preparing for the day's duties, their paths seemed to subtly divert around her. They gave her a wide berth, not out of fear, but out of a deep and abiding respect. They would catch her eye and offer a crisp nod, a gesture she would return in kind. The coffee girl was gone, erased from the collective memory of the base. In her place stood a guardian. A young private, the same one from the rescued Falcon 2 patrol, approached her. He was carrying a rifle, not his own standard issue M4, but a finely tuned State Route 25 marksman rifle. It was cleaned, oiled, and calibrated to a level of perfection that spoke of hours of meticulous work. He stopped a few feet away, holding the rifle out to her, but stock first. "Figured you might want something with a little more reach, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet. The armorer said it was spare. "We tuned it up for you." It wasn't an order. It wasn't a requisition. It was an offering, a tribute. It was the soldiers of the base acknowledging who and what she was and arming their protector without ever being asked. They were giving her back the tools of her trade. Claire looked from the young soldier's earnest face to the rifle. She took it from him, the weight familiar and comforting in her hands. She worked the charging handle, the sound a solid, satisfying clack in the morning quiet. She checked the optics, her eyes scanning the distant ridgeline. "Thank you, Specialist," she said, using his proper title. He simply nodded, gave a quick, respectful glance, and walked away, leaving her alone on the perimeter. Claire didn't return to the TOC immediately. She remained at her post on the wall, the rifle held loosely in one hand, the warm mug in the other. She was a silent, solitary figure against the vast, hostile landscape. She was no longer Specialist Harlow, the administrative clerk. She wasn't even Kestrel, the ghost from a forgotten war. She was simply a hyper-competent woman in her rightful place, a quiet sentinel whose value was no longer in question. Her dignity was intact, her respect earned not through rank or words, but through the undeniable truth of her skill. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more gripping tales like this one. Your support keeps the stories alive. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on Claire's journey and what comes next.